Hello everybody and welcome to today's webinar. This is a Unily webinar, and the topic of today's webinar is to discuss the role of technology in powering diversity and inclusion within the workplace. One of the reasons that we obviously wanted to talk about such an important topic right now, or it's really twofold actually. First and foremost, Unily believes that everyone should be involved in the conversation around diversity and inclusion, and as an organization, it's something we feel very passionately about. And beyond that, of course, it's International Women's Week, so an excellent time for us to pick up this conversation with our audience and internally, and really engage in some progressive and insightful conversations on the topic. The format of today's webinar will actually be an expert panel. And as I mentioned before, my name is Matthew Boyd, and I'm hosting the panel today. So I work for Unily, and Unily is an employee experience platform provider. So we're really focused on delivering those digital experiences that engage employees in an organization's culture, provide them with a voice, and support the kind of two-way communication that helps organizations to really thrive. So in terms of my panelists today, I'm going to hand over to each of them to introduce themselves. So I'm going to begin by handing over to Nancy.
Thank you, Matt. It's exciting to be here. I'm Nancy Spidell. I am the founder and CEO of ISAW International, and we are thrilled to be partnering with Unily. We're actually launching an initiative using Unily's technology to advance gender equality on a global scale, and so it's an honor to be here. So thank you, Matt.
Thanks, Nancy. And our second panelist is Advita Patel.
Hi, thanks, Matt. Really a pleasure to be here. My name is Advita, as Matt said. I'm the co-founder of A Leader Like Me, which is a program aimed at underrepresented people who want to progress further in their career. And I'm also the director of Comms Rebel, which is an internal communications and employee experience consultancy based up in Manchester.
Awesome, thank you. And then next we have Lynn.
Yeah, hi Matt, hi everybody. Thank you so much for inviting me today. I'm really excited about this topic, particularly in International Women's Day week. I have worked in organisational change, culture change, and specifically in diversity and inclusion for the last 12 years in diversity, 20 years plus in really helping organisations to build high performance culture through inclusion. I've worked in financial services, oil and gas, and technology, and currently I'm working as the DE&I director for Sage Belong, and I'm also a co-founder of ISAW with Nancy, just to declare that. Thank you.
Thank you. And last but by no means least, joined by Joe Skilton.
Thank you, Matthew, as always. Hi, my name's Joe. I'm Chief Commercial Officer for Unily and have been for about 3 or 4 years now. My background is very much FTSE 100, big businesses, and I probably qualify for being on the panel because I've been in a very male-dominated industry for many years. So I started my life in property and have moved forward into tech. So yeah, some interesting changes I'm sure we'll talk about a bit more this afternoon.
Amazing, thank you so much. So that's our speaker lineup for today. So really exciting, and thank you all so much for taking the time to be a part of the conversation. Now, just before we get into the panel in earnest, I just wanted to do a small bit of housekeeping for everyone who's on the call today. So first and foremost, there will be a Q&A section, and we really want you to be involved in the conversation. So if you do want to raise a question or have any comments that you'd like to make, then please do use the Zoom features for Q&A or for chatting. And I can see some of you already engaged in there, which is fantastic. But we will have a dedicated Q&A portion. I'll do my best to pick up questions in context as we go along as well. So please do get involved. So without further ado, we're going to hop into the panel. In terms of the panel today and our speakers, I really wanted to start the conversation today with a very open question, and I'd like to know, from the panelists, for example, how do you feel about the state of diversity, equity, and inclusion in the enterprise in 2021? I'm interested to know whether you feel the conversation has progressed over recent years, rapidly, slowly, and really just to set the scene for us and the attendees today. And Advita, I thought that perhaps you would be a good person to open up the conversation for us today.
Thanks, Matthew. I have to be honest, I go through peaks and troughs on how far diversity, equity, and inclusion and belonging, because I think that's equally important, has transitioned over the last few years. And some days I think we're doing really well, and then I'll have a conversation, and some days I'll think, oh my goodness, have we gone back 20 years? I have to say, in terms, if we break it down in terms of race, if we're looking at race, I would say since the tragic murder of George Floyd, there has been a spotlight on race diversity. Whether that's right or wrong, the way people are doing it, the people are talking about it, which is always a good thing in my view. The challenge I have is I get a lot of people saying we're listening and we're reading things and we're paying attention, but what I'm not seeing, and this is the case for other underrepresented and protected characteristics as well, and women as well, is that there's no real action. So we did for example, we take the women gender pay gap. We did the reports, amazing, that's fantastic, great. We know there's a big gap between what women get paid and what men get paid. But I couldn't tell you which organizations are actually doing some good work. And all those organizations that shared on International Women's Day about gender pay gap and how, celebrating women and all that, if you look at their record on the .gov where they've had to declare what the pay gap is, it's quite shocking. So it makes me think, what are you, it's like the black squares again on Instagram, right? Great, you put a black square on Instagram to support Black Lives Matter, but what action are you actually doing personally yourself, but also within your organization to make a difference? So I think people are talking about it, which is a great thing, and I don't think that's a bad thing to do, but it is about what are you actually doing to make a difference in the place that you're in and in your own personal circumstances as well.
Yeah, that's that's really interesting. The the black squares on Instagram, for example, being a sign of being involved in the conversation, but how do we take it further? How do we kind of act on that to progress beyond just having conversations and delivering proof of progress? Perhaps if I hand over to Nancy, how do you feel about the state of diversity and inclusion where we are today?
Yeah, so I'm going to build on Avita's conversation because she's right. The fact that now countries and companies all around the world are talking about diversity and inclusion, that's a really good thing. 10 years ago, that wasn't happening. So just the fact the conversation is happening at that scale globally and at all levels, and the fact we're having this type of event, but I actually think we need to evolve the conversation. Because everybody's talking about diversity and inclusion, which is important, and we need that. But that's kind of the input measure, right? We need inclusive environments, but once we have those, what do we get? What's the outcome of that? And that's where we need to start actually changing the conversation, because when we start talking about the value women bring, not only economically, but socially, but business outcomes, then it actually justifies change. It's not about let's be nice to women. It's like, what do women bring when they get a seat at the table? So I think the conversation needs to evolve into the value of diversity, not just the fact we need diversity.
Yeah, absolutely. And Lynn, obviously with your position and your role, I mean, how do you feel about diversity and inclusion at the moment? And, building on that, the point has been made a couple of times about measuring outcomes. How hard is that, and can you do it?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. So I have, as I say, specialised for the last 12 years in D&I. So I've been watching closely what's been going on. And I would say 12 years ago, I was asked to do a piece of work on what would the big organisation, they're all FTSE 100s in that time. What is it that organisations need to do in terms of a best practice framework? And I spent a lot of time researching that. What are other organisations doing? And I can honestly tell you there is an absolutely phenomenal shift from what was available then by way of research and infrastructure and the way this gets approached in D&I teams than there is now. So looking at it from a big picture perspective, I think you're seeing these organisations massively shift. I think it started with diversity, which was about the numbers, then it moved to inclusion, now it's talking about equity, and and to echo Nancy, it's the value. And some of the examples I thought of were, increasingly analysts and regulators and investors are looking at what organizations are doing. You've got regulatory bodies expecting boards to look at and look at their own diversity as well as what they're doing. I think the documentation and research into the benefits, as you say, Nancy, and McKinsey is the one that springs to mind, but there are some others, but that's the most renowned. Those business benefits are really understood, and I think particularly as organisations shift and they have looking at the representation of their customer base, they want employees who are going to, represent that customer base. So you can build creativity and innovation through the diversity, and then build products and services that are going to actually reflect. And I think just in the so I get Avita's point completely, because it's taking a while to shift into the numbers change, and there is frustration about that. And typically the gender pay gap is completely driven by the number of men in these big roles. There's nothing more sinister. It's not equal pay typically, it's just the number of men in the big roles. But if you think over that 12 years that I've been looking at it, you've got, you've had the Lord Davis report, you've got the Hampton Alexander now report looking at women. We've had 30% club women on boards, looking at one down. We've got gender pay gap reporting. We're going to have ethnicity pay gap and reporting, and then more specifically, in the UK, McGregor Smith and Parker review on ethnicity. So there's some really big ticket items that I think are really about building the foundation. And then those movements like Me Too and Black Lives Matter all have a shift as well. So I would say it's hugely ramped up. I think that it's you've only got to look at the number of diversity jobs out there at the moment to know it's at the peak of interest. But is it translating into the numbers? Still slow. And some days, like you, Advita, I think, goodness me, if I just gone back 25 years to when I worked in the motor industry and I was subjected to sexism every day. So yeah, that would be my answer, Matt. Thanks.
No, very interesting. And I was going to say, because this is an area where I profess I'm not highly aware, but diversity and inclusion and equity jobs and roles within organizations, that's rapidly increasing, is it? People specifically owning that conversation within organizations.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think from there has, when you think a lot of roles have been put on hold, if you like, after or during COVID, actually Black Lives Matter kicked off a movement like I haven't ever seen, more so than the gender agenda. And as such, organisations are very acutely aware that they've got to be doing the right thing. Whether they want to do the right thing, which I totally believe they do, because they understand it's both morally correct and commercially, sensible. I think that they now recognise that they are hugely under scrutiny. You've only got to look in the press every single day to see, the KPMG UK chairman's just got sacked for saying unconscious bias doesn't exist. The guys running Olympics says I'm not having women on my committee because they talk too much. So there's all these kind of major things going on that is just really showing that people have got to be really on this, and so therefore they want some expertise to help them.
Yeah. Absolutely. And Joe, what about you? How do you feel about diversity and inclusion where we are today? Given as you talked about, your career journey, does it feel like there's been significant progress? Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very interesting times. I think what we're doing more now than we've ever done is talking about things. But as the rest of the panel have said, it's not just about talking, it's about action. I, for one, hate to be seen as a quota. I think it's about, real inclusion and diversity is about getting lots of different people in a room and having a really great conversation and getting to an agreement with lots of different input. And I think it's about recognition and appreciation for who we are and what we do, no matter who we are. I was making one of my colleagues laugh the other day because I did a phone call about a non-exec director role, and I started chatting to them and I said, what's their sort of mission critical need for this role? What's driving it? And they said they really need a woman on the board. And I thought, well, I'm sorry, you just shut the door, because I don't want to be on a board because I'm a woman. I want to be on a board because I'm the right person to be on the board and bring the right, qualifications and experience to bear. So I think, yes, we're talking a lot about it. I think, what I've seen at Unily as a tech company, we have a very young workforce. I think, the user experience of the technology that they use enables them to talk more openly about what, their thoughts and their feelings. So I think this is probably the most honest rhetoric in terms of inclusion and diversity that I've heard in any company that I've ever worked for. But if you think about it, working in the property industry, it is very white, male, middle class still. And so I'm in a very different industry now, albeit tech, but because we're quite a young company, we are pretty diverse. We are a global business, and we really celebrate that. And I think, but that we still need to be very mindful of how we do that and how we share that. And I was talking to one of the guys last night, Clay, who's part of our sales team in the US, and he was talking about employee advocacy and being able to share what we're doing internally at Unily with the rest, with people outside of the business. And I think, from a young audience, from a young employee audience, that's really, really important.
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. And, I think, we are, I think at Unily, very lucky, because I think that the conversation happens for us, and we've got, leaders like you, for example, who are interested in what people bring to the business, not, any not any facets of who they are as a person, but specifically the value they can bring to the organization.
I think the other thing that's important is that, whilst people drive change, culture is so important to this sort of thing as well. And we talk about technology being, the facilitator of change, but really it's about culture and embedded culture in an organization that really helps facilitate change. And I'm a big believer in that. And I think I've grown up to understand that. I don't think I used to think about that years ago. I mean, I was shocked when Nancy told me it'd be something like 99 years for us to achieve true equality, gender equality, and then said, but in some countries that's going to be at least 200. And I was like, but that's crazy. Like, I just couldn't really get my head around. I still can't, as Nancy knows, but I guess that's one of the great things about what Nancy and the team are doing at ISAW and bringing that to the fore and having that conversation.
I think it's really interesting, actually, because a lot of my personal learning on the topic, really the eye-opening moments, came from when Advita, for example, shared some of her own experiences of a lack of diversity and inclusion awareness in her own personal career. And I actually thought, I think a really great way I found to kind of learn and kind of understand the topic more broadly has been to hear about those stories and to understand how it is that women such as yourself have dealt with adversity over the years. I mean, Joe, obviously you've shared a little bit there. Advita, perhaps you can share, with the audience today, what kind of adversity have you come across in your own personal experiences, and how have you challenged that, or kind of had had to deal with it, I guess?
It's, you know what, I've worked in organizations that have been very male dominated and very white male dominated industries, and I've been one of very few people of color and a woman in those situations, and it has been a challenge. I'm not going to lie. I faced a lot of and you start questioning your worth, right? So we talk a lot about imposter syndrome and the fact that women struggle with imposter syndrome. I know some men do as well, but one thing to remember about imposter syndrome, you generally feel like an imposter is because the situation that you're in doesn't allow you to belong, and you feel like a fraud, and you feel like you are one of the lucky ones who have made it, because when you look around the room, you don't see leaders who look like you or leaders that you can connect with, because everybody else is so different from you. So then you start thinking, well, what am I doing here, and how did I make it here? So I'm not going to say anything in case they think I'm being silly or I'm making some ridiculous comment, because I don't have any advocates in this room, or you don't think you've got any advocates in that room. And you start thinking about the story, right, that you're telling yourself as well at the time. And that's why the imposter syndrome phenomenon kind of exists to an extent. But I want anyone who's listening today to remember that part of that isn't all on you. It is sometimes about the circumstances that you're surrounded with and the people in the organizations. So when I talk to leaders, I will encourage them to look outside of their narrow mind sometimes, which they do have, and their own biases. So if you're sat in a room and you look around the table and they're all white men of a certain age, then there's a problem, right, in that organization, especially when you look across the organization and your operational level colleagues are a mix of diversities. But the higher you go up the chain, that starts filtering out, and then you start thinking to yourself, what is going on? And that's the kind of challenges I face. I've been overlooked because people have made assumptions about my background, about my gender, about the fact that I, because I'm South Asian, so that must mean that I must get married at a certain age and have children, and make those kind of assumptions on top of all of that. The cultural assumptions that people make about me as well. And it's a challenge to kind of step into that space. And you do need a level of confidence as an underrepresented group at times to step into that with the majority folks and have that conversation. And I acknowledge that there are people probably listening today who feel like they're a bit at loss. And I always say, to one of my, and I saw a question just pop up actually, I was just glancing down and somebody said about cultural change.
Yes.
And one thing, a very tactical tip for me that I give to leaders that I work with is create a safe environment in your organization where people can ask uncomfortable questions, and people can also raise situations that they have faced into without the fear of being reprimanded for speaking up about it. And people will say to me, leaders are like, oh, I've got a really open and transparent organization and I'm really comfortable with people talk. My door is always open. And we always kind of say, but is it really open? Can people really talk about these uncomfortable subjects? Can they really raise it? What are you going to do about it? Because getting someone to talk about the situation they've been through is a triggering experience, right? And you're asking them to open up a load of emotions and wounds. And then you listen, you empathize to an extent, and even in some cases sympathize, which nobody really wants, but you do that. And then you kind of hope it goes away and you don't action it. And which is why I'm so keen that if you are going to put things in place, if you're going to put a policy in place and you're going to put actions in place to say that this is what we're going to do, then do it. Don't not do it because it's a bit too hard or it's a bit too difficult, or and that's what I say, because people like myself and the people on the call today, I'm guaranteed that all of us have got our stories where you've been overlooked, I've been told to go and fetch the coffees, as soon as I walk into a room to do a presentation. The director would say, oh, Advita, can you get 3 coffees, 2 teas and a cold water for me, please? And unless you step into that space and go, I'm not the canteen staff, so no, I'm not doing that.
Can I ask you a quick question? How did you deal with that? Because I had the same, and I used to purposely never sit where they brought the drinks in, because all the men would look at me to pour the tea and coffee. So I used to go into the room, watch where they used to bring the drinks in, and sit down the other end. And we used to go through some meetings where no one had a drink because I hadn't poured the tea and coffee. So I'm interested to see how you dealt with that.
The first time it happened, I did it. I have to admit, I was like, oh, okay. So I went and got them. And then absolutely stewed the entire meeting, raging that I'd been asked to make a cup of tea. I couldn't even focus on the meeting because I was so mad about it. And then I raised it with my boss, and when I went back to the office, I said, I'm not having that. I'm not having them asking to make me the drinks and then say to me, oh, you didn't leave the tea bag in long enough. Those kind of comments. I'm like, So when I went, the next time I went in, and the director said to me, "Oh, can you get the drinks?" I was like, "I don't think it's my turn to make the drinks. I think somebody else needs to go and make the drinks." And I just sat down. And he didn't know what to say, because like he's not going to say to me, "I want you to go and make the drinks right now." And if he did, that's when that, you know, we would have to have that leaning into that courageous conversation. But it's having the guts to say, "No, I'm not taking the minutes," because I've been asked to do that, right? And because I work in comms, so often it does fall to comms to say, "Can you take the minutes for this meeting?" So I'd say, "I'm sorry, but if I take the minutes of this meeting, then I can't contribute what I'm meant to be contributing. So is there any way that PA could come in and take the minutes? Otherwise, let's record it, and then the PA can type up
and
the
did you
notes."
feel that? Did you feel then that people responded positively to that, or did they sort of roll their eyes and see you then as trouble?
It was mixed. I had people who respected me. So the women in the room who heard me say that respected me for it, and would come over to me afterwards and go, "Oh my goodness, I can't believe you said that to them. That's amazing." And some of the men like used to jeer, you know, like say the comment. But I have to say, through an experience I had, which I haven't shared today, and I wrote a blog about it. So Matthew, I'm very happy for you to share that blog to everybody. I spoke about microaggressions facing a colleague that I used to work with, a black woman who worked in comms, and the behavior that was put towards her. I'm not going to talk about it on here because it is a bit emotional and people can read it if they want to, but because of the situation that happened with her quite early on in my career, I promised myself that I would never allow anyone else to experience what she experienced. And even though I may be a disruptor, I have to say that I'd rather be that positive disruptor and make sure that experience that happened to my friend that I used to work with never happens to anyone again, because I never want anyone leaving this earth feeling like they were not respected and valued for the work they were doing. And if it means you have to step into that courageous conversation and they don't like it, then to be honest with you, I'm privileged enough to be in a position to kind of not care enough either. You know, if I believe that this is the right thing to say and I've got the privilege to do that, then I will say that I am not making that tea and I'm not taking those minutes, and it's unfair for you to ask me to do that.
I do think it's really important for all of us, and I'm sure those listening to the panel, so you have to call things out like that. I always think you can't moan about something or someone unless you've addressed it with them personally. If they continue then with that behaviour, then you need to go seek help somewhere else. But I do think for, you know, people that are listening to the panel today and thinking, how do I actually deal with this? You know, I think the first thing you have to do is call it out and say, this isn't acceptable behaviour.
So I mean,
it does take courage. It does take courage to do it, and I acknowledge
hard,
those people who are not in the position. It's hard, so it's baby steps, right? So it's little things, and it's forming that community around you to help you empower to do that, knowing that your boss, your community will back you up if you step into that space and say, "I am not making the tea and I'm not doing the minutes."
And I think, you know, I guess a part of those experiences, and thank you, by the way, both Joe and Advita, for, you know, sharing those kind of stories with our attendees today, because I think it, you know, takes a certain amount of bravery to even kind of talk about those things, you know, in these kind of forums. So thank you for that. But I mean, when we talk about that, and the question was around cultural change, I mean, and, you know, I'm going to throw this one over to Lynn. You know, when we talk about challenging those actions and therefore looking to change the culture of the organization to be, you know, to support greater diversity and inclusion, what are the kind of opportunities that presents to the business? I mean, you know, and to everyone who works for the business. I mean, you know, trying to take what is, you know, these negative experiences and trying to focus on what positivity we get from progressing the conversation. What opportunities does progressing the conversation of diversity and inclusion represent for organizations?
Yeah, thank you, Matt. I think, you know, that's an absolutely ginormous question.
Yeah, that's why I threw it to you, because I knew you had all the answers.
Yeah, so I guess, you know, what the work that I would do with a big picture would be to say, how do you build a culture where everybody can thrive, not just survive, but thrive and excel, irrespective of any difference, you know, that they bring. Because, you know, to the points made already, if you feel like you are safe and you belong somewhere and you have a voice, you're going to contribute, and your you're going to put your ideas forward, you're going to be happier, you're going to be more engaged, you'll get discretionary effort. So everyone's a winner in that kind of environment. So why wouldn't you seek to do that? And I think organizations, and I know Unily does, and I know Sage does, and I know ISO does, you know, has strong sets of values that actually guide the behavior. So it's not about regulation. There are things that you can have about the right culture and speak up culture and things, but it's actually, you would want your employees to really be driven by the values. So in the moment they make that decision based on what's right for the organization. The other part of your question around, you know, what are the opportunities? Well, you know, they are in abundance, because you know, somebody who I was working with on a particular quite strategic project, you know, talked about regeneration and basically said, look, you either regenerate or you die. Organizations regenerate or they die. And actually, when you think about who sits around the table now, who sits in the decision making, what kind of, how is this business working today? And then you sat down and said, well, how is it going to look in 5 years' time, and how might it look in 10 years' time? And we probably, with AI and everything coming in, we've got no idea what it's going to look like, you know, kind of expect the pace of change is so fast. So you've got you've got all of those commercial elements, you've got the whole, you know, changing world of work, and how to, you know, the war for talent has not gone away. You know, it's only actually you know, amplified, and talent's really discerning. So now they can look and say, I'm not working for that organization, you know, and so there's a lot of that goes on. And I think that it, you know, so it's really about how are you going to keep this, get your organization in a place where you continue to thrive and innovate and regenerate and change and morph. And I think there's so much more around, you know, it's not just being the other change I guess we've seen, it's not just being a great employer and a great organization in isolation. We work across an ecosystem of organizations for, you know, greater societal good. And we all have a big responsibility, and I think there's much more scrutiny on that. So, you know, talent want to work in an organization where they know their organization's ethical, and it, you know, the give back agenda. So all of this kind of, you know, plays together. So I would say, you know, the challenges would be if you don't think about your inclusion and you don't think about that future, your organization very quickly, you'll look up one day and you'll just think, how the heck was I just overtaken by, you know, when I've had market share forever? And we're seeing that happen all the time, aren't we? So it's that new thinking, that pace of change, and yeah, that would be some of my responses to that question.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I know actually, you know, actually you said in the earlier question as well, which kind of in part also fed into this answer, was about, and I know that Advita spoke about this when we had our sessions prior to today's panel event, about, you know, innovation as well, and just different viewpoints. The very fact that you can bring different viewpoints to a table means that you're not, I don't know, designing products in isolation, trying to find a solution to a problem by just looking at what, you know, this one small group of people who can be identified X way would go about solving that problem, but being able to be more progressive as an organization by, you know, bringing a variety of different opinions and viewpoints onto any challenge, any problem. And I think, you know, that leads me on nicely to another point that I wanted to cover with you today. I think there's a couple of different angles here actually, but I'm keen to know from, you know, all the panelists, and I'm going to go to Nancy first, but I'd like to know, how important do you think technology is in progressing the conversation around diversity and inclusion?
I think technology used correctly can be a game changer. There's information everywhere and it's nowhere, right? So, I mean, the reports Lynn just talked about, the beautiful information and stories that Avita just shared in the blog, but it's everywhere. And I speak publicly now internationally on women in the workplace, and what I told you about the stories about Joe, what I told you about the World Economic Forum, right? It's going to be another 100 years on average, and people don't know this information, right? There's the McKinsey report. There's so much information. So how do we actually take this information and assimilate it in a way that's not traditional training? Because traditional training is a thing of the past. We need transformational leap learning. And we have to use technology to get this in the hands of individuals all around the world. And if we can target it to them specifically based on their areas of interest, needs, making sure it's relevant at a local level for them, they have a connection to a global level on what's happening for gender equality, and we actually change the way that we give information, source information, make it accessible on your phone at your fingertips like any other, social media type experience. But instead of social media where it's pushing out, who am I, what am I doing? We're turning it a 360 and we're saying, how do I learn? How do I raise my awareness? How do I understand the value women bring? How do I collectively understand the challenges we face? And so this webinar right now is so important, and we have like 200 participants, right? But in the big scheme of things, how do we reach 30 million? And it's only through technology that we reach 30 million. And how do we do it in their local language, in their local context, but connecting them on a global vision that actually has an opportunity to advance those numbers of 200 to 100 to 200 years. I want to cut them in half, and I want to use Unily's capability to do that.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
so technology is, if we want to move the dial faster forward, we have to use technology, but we have to use it in a way that we target it, and we also have to use it information differently. We can't have big pieces of data. We have to have sound bites that are moving fast to raise that awareness, that are easily consumable.
And I think what you're doing really well with ISOR, Nancy, is personalising that content as well, because we live in a world where we have access to everything all of the time. And I think being able to personalise that content so that you're surfacing what's important to you is really, really important today.
Yeah, and that's why the sweet spot between, I think, Unily's technology capability, ISO's content curation, and that targeted, laser focused, this is who needs what, when, where, it is really going to be an opportunity to make a huge impact on a global stage.
And I think there's another really interesting aspect of technology in regards to difficult conversations that should be happening, is the advent of social, both inside the organization and externally. And I know, for example, after I met Advita in preparation for this, I stumbled upon via LinkedIn Priya Bates, and that was the podcast I was talking about Advita before, where I was like, I just stumbled across this great little podcast segment. And it's amazing how much the social aspect of technology gives people a voice when they're having conversations which are difficult to have, and almost can like democratize the conversation and provides people with like a more level playing field to have the conversation. And that aspect of technology, I think, is really important too. I mean, it's something that we've obviously, done, looked at a lot internally, but I think that the social aspect of things is really powerful as well. This new kind of the new opportunities we get, the new ways to communicate. It's easier now to kind of download a podcast, watch a video, and be educated and learn and be involved in the conversation. And a lot of that, I think, is driven by the technology, both inside the organization and outside of it as well.
Yeah, sorry, after you, Jo.
No, I was going to say, but it's as Nancy said, it's using the technology effectively, because equally it can do a lot of harm, right? So, and I think we've seen that over the last few days, for whatever reason. But I do think it's about harnessing the right technology to get the right messages out to the right audiences and surfacing the right content.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Actually, that was something I was thinking about just the other day, Jo, is, social technology, social capabilities can actually do a lot of harm. But we're actually going to focus our efforts to do a lot of good right? With really driving an agenda and awareness, using everything you talked about, Matt, using podcasts, using videos, but getting it in their fingertips where they don't have to find it, it comes to them. And it's talking about diversity and inclusion, it's educating them, it's making them connected. And so all of those aspects you've talked about, but used in a way that we're trying to service a greater good and drive an agenda of equality across the world is, I think, a powerful opportunity to use technology.
And
The
Lynn,
other bit I was going to add to that question from a slightly different angle is actually how, you know, technology has completely enabled workplace participation in a way that we haven't seen. So that, you know, the whole COVID, I mean, I was working on trying to implement flexible working, you know, 15 years ago, and eyes were rolling, as you can imagine, can't work at home and all that rubbish. And then all of a sudden, you know, COVID comes and everybody's working at home, and all of a sudden people go, actually, this does work. And, you know, but when you think about how, what has that meant for diversity or inclusion, it means that, you know, everybody, like, you know, your point you already made, Matt, about, you know, it's very leveling and people have a voice, but it means that a lot of the groups who perhaps couldn't participate previously now can participate in a much more equal way. And, you know, you've got accessible solutions. So you've got much different way of working, and, you know, long may that continue. I think it will have shifted the world forever. So the technology and the ability or the role that's playing in the changing world of work, you know, is absolutely phenomenal. We wouldn't have been able to do this, you know, and broadcast it, as you say. So that has played out very well, where you've got less hierarchies and teams sitting next to each other. And now we're in global communities, and how do you have a global community? It's all technology enabled. So the whole, you know, way, the future of work, the way work's structured, and the role that technology is playing in those global communities, you know, is game changing.
And last question before we move on to Q&A, and I just wanted to, actually, two last questions. I lied, I've got two last questions. The last one for Advita, I just wanted to ask, you talked a little bit about building a sense of belonging for people so that they can feel like they belong. You know, do you think technology makes that easier because there's less of a physical space and therefore belonging is easier to achieve in, like, when you're separated by technology, or do you think it makes it harder?
It definitely, you know, and it depends on circumstances and how that technology is being used. Is what Nancy said before. It can be used for good and bad, right? And I'm always on pro tech because I think it has helped change so many different things, and crucially, it's helped the people whose voices have never been heard before be heard. In a space where they potentially, because of hierarchy, because they don't get that visibility at senior management level, all of a sudden things like Workplace for Facebook and Yammer and all the enterprise social networks and things like Unily gives people voices that just never could ever be able to share with their senior leadership team, normally 4 or 5 levels down. So it can really help you belong if you are allowed to belong, in a sense. So you may raise a question, but if you're ignored in those, you know, if you've got the technology and you're raising questions and then you're dismissed or ignored, or you get the eye roll, or people are a bit dismissive and the bias plays a big part in it, then it can do more harm than good. So you're giving, it's almost like a teaser. So you're giving people this access and told them that every voice counts, bring your whole self into the business. It's important that you belong. You get to be with us when we collaborate and drive innovation. Then your behavior doesn't show that or demonstrate that, then it can be quite toxic, and it can create quite a toxic culture where, you know, there's this whole sense of getting people to contribute, but then not acknowledging their contribution, and not acknowledging and not giving them the reward or the recognition and the appreciation for that. And that's a danger. But for me personally, I think technology is definitely a way forward. It helps with flexible working. It helps with people who have not got a voice to be heard. It gives people access to information that they never had access to before. You know, if you take 20 years ago, there's no way you could have Googled things that you Google and find podcasts and read books online about. So, which is why on the other side of things, there's really no excuse not to know what is going on in this space, because the information is readily available to you if you want to know more. I understood 20 years ago it's harder, right? When you're stuck in a little town in the middle of nowhere, it's difficult to understand what's going on around you. But with technology and access points, there's really no reason not to go and educate yourself a little bit more about what's happening.
Absolutely. Okay. So just before we open up to Q&A, I always think that, it's really great if our attendees can have some small takeaway. And I wanted to ask each one of our panelists today is if there is one thing that each person on this call today can take away to help them be a better ally and to support a more progressive diversity, equity, and inclusion conversation within their respective organization, what's that one tip you'd give them? Nancy, I see you're ready to go, so I'll hand over to you first. What's your top tip?
Yeah, my top tip is when you think about success, don't think about individual success. Think about collective success. Because when it's collective success and it's done through empathy, through understanding, we have better outcomes. So how you think about success, think about other success along with your own.
Amazing, thank you. Joe, I can see that you're unmuted, so I'm going to throw to you next.
You know me, Matt, I'm always unmuted, right? I read a great quote the other day. It said, when we listen and celebrate what is both common and different, we become a wiser, more inclusive and better organisation. And I wrote that down because it really felt that that's where we were as an organisation. But I guess, the big takeaway for me is, as for all the difficulty that COVID has given the world, it has accelerated change for working from home. And as Lynn said earlier, we've both sat around tables where people have talked about flexible working hours, and it's like, yes, okay, come in at 8:30 instead of 9, but you still got to do your hours, so you can't go home till 6. We should remember that the working day was invented by a man from 9 to 5 because his wife was at home. And I think the big thing for me is we need to embrace the change that working from home has enabled organisations, because that really does fuel the talent that goes into the top of the funnel and top of the pipeline. There is no reason for people not to really embrace this. And, and I think we have to be the change agents, in terms of the change we want to see.
Amazing, thank you. Lynn, why don't you go next with your top tip?
Yeah, I always used to have a top tip, but I pinched this one off somebody I heard last week, so I thought that is brilliant. and actually what it is, just challenge the stereotypes, because they are so dangerous. They're the things that are shaping what we, without challenging them, they're shaping our decisions for the future. And the two I would call out is, what does a leader look like? So think about that for yourself stereotypically, and then what does it look like for the future? And then the other topic of passion, which I'm sure we could all come back and talk about, another one if you'd have us back, would be about girls in technology. And actually, tech jobs are for boys and tech jobs are geeky and boring, and actually both of those have massive stereotypes that the likes of PwC and TechSheCan and are just trying to blast that out of the water. So let's do what we can to change the stereotypes, because that's going to change the representation and the future. Amazing,
thank you. And then Advita, your top tip.
Well, following on from what Joe and Lynn just said, and my favourite quote, which I say to myself often when I am facing into adversity and have to challenge, is, if you were everyone's cup of tea, you'd be a mug. So don't
That's
ever
amazing.
think that, so if you have to do something, you're not there to be loved. You've got to do the right thing, and as long as you're doing the right thing, think of yourself that you don't want to be a mug, right? So step into that space, have that conversation. If you feel someone is being mistreated or undermined or whatever, then step into that and have that conversation and support them, because the small ripples in the organization where you may think you don't have influence or you're not the decision maker, those small ripples can create a big wave, and that's what we need to create actual change. So and this is coming from a previous chronic people pleaser, by the way. This was me before, and I had to, over the last 10 years, I really had to work under that mug quote, which I have actually got in a pin badge now, that I love it that much. and I remind myself on it often. So if there's one thing you take away, then don't be a mug.
That's amazing. You totally caught me off guard with that. I love it. I absolutely love it. It's very true as well. I completely get it. Like, it resonates. So lots of participation, and I'm rapidly running out of time with all of our amazing speakers. So I'm going to hop straight into the Q&A. First question: it would be great to hear from the panel examples of D&I communications campaigns that they thought made a positive impact and, cause positive change. And I'm wondering, Lynn, given your history working in those roles, can you talk about any kind of campaigns that have been run within organizations you worked for to drive?
Yeah, I can think of one that actually maybe everybody who's ever been on an aeroplane will have seen, which is the HSBC campaigns about difference. And they've been running, diversity, but through their business agenda for a very long time. And I think that's been fantastic, because it's not the D&I agenda, it's actually through the business. And so I would say they would be one of the award-winning ones. And it was, and one of the subsets of that was focus on what matters. And there were lots of big words on a page, like race and ethnicity and gender, but actually the big words that came out were talent, ability, capabilities. So actually what does really matter? All of those other things are diminished, and those big words about what you can actually bring to the party is what counts. And that was from an employee perspective. So I would definitely look up HSBC, top brand there.
Amazing, really good one. Thank you. And then another good question here: how do we educate and empower men to become allies and supporters? And I'm going to throw this one out to Nancy.
Thank you. And for every man that sits on this session right now, you're our heroes, right? So it's so important to have men on this journey with us. This is not a women's only journey. And it's not that they walk in front of us or they walk behind us, but they walk right beside us. And it's not one big step. It's a lot of little steps to get us to the direction and the place we need to be. But men are so important, and men are important in a lot of ways. They're so important. They're actually members of ISA, and we have a men's program in ISA because they're critical to the journey of gender equality. And there's a couple ways. One is, how do men support women? How do women support men that are our allies? And then how do men show up to other men? Right. And so, first of all, the men to supporting women, you just being on this panel event is a huge statement. Participate in the conversation. Make sure that you kind of address your own biases and call out the biases of others to actually would inhibit or limit women's opportunities. So that's a big thing, is show up for women. And for women, we have to really acknowledge the role and the importance that men bring to this conversation. And then for the men that are true allies and true champions, how you show up in the conversations where women aren't involved with other men is so important. It's so important, because your voice is going to influence more than our voice ever could. And so thank you for that opportunity to answer that question, because it's such an important question.
Yeah, absolutely. And then I'm gonna go one last question as well. And if I can pose this one to you, Advita, and then to you afterwards, Joe. What are some actions that you can employ within your business to foster cultural change, to take forwards the conversation about diversity and inclusion? So Advita, over to you first.
First of all, I would, as a basic step, is create some safe spaces to ask these conversations. I think that's really important. If you don't have a space where people can have these chats, then make sure you create them. So whether that's on your ESN, whether it's a Zoom drop-in, whatever, just create a space where people can ask questions. Second thing I would say is be curious. So if you look around the room and everyone looks the same and talks the same and behaves the same, then go outside into your workforce and go and ask the questions, go and speak to your recruitment team, go and speak to your HR team, go and speak to comms, speak to the workforce, go and ask those questions and be curious about what's working, what isn't working, and try and understand that little bit more. And the third thing, which is really important, is don't be afraid to fail. You will get it wrong. There's no denying it. I get it wrong. Everyone gets it wrong, and you may make a mistake. You may say the wrong terminology, but unless you make that mistake, you won't know that you've got it wrong, right? So don't fear crossing that minefield, because you will get burnt a little bit, but you have to be able to cross it in order to learn and understand exactly what's going on in the culture in your business. So be open, be transparent, stay curious, and don't be afraid to fail.
Amazing. And Joe, actions we can take to promote cultural change?
I would echo everything Avita just said, and I think it's really important to have the conversation, which is where we started. I know at Unily we do things like employee engagement surveys, and that sounds sometimes a bit cold, but it gives people an opportunity to really think about what they want to share and share it on a personal level. But then we actually act on it. So we had something, our recent one was something like, 84% in terms of advocacy and for people actually feeling engaged. And, one of the key things was that people, Shavaz, one of the guys that works with us, who is just awesome in our US team, said he really feels that he can truly be his authentic self at Unily. And that makes me quite emotional, actually. But I think it's culture is so important. It's how you engage with your employees, and everyone's human at the end of the day. And if we treat people like we want to be treated, I think that's a really good start. Really good start.
Absolutely. So we're now down to the last minute, so perfect time for me to wrap things up for today, because we are unfortunately out of time. I wanted to start by and I'm sure I'm joined by all our attendees to say thank you to Nancy, Lynn, Advita, and Joe for joining us and having this conversation. I think, and I can speak on behalf of Unily when I say this is a very important conversation that needs to be had. It needs to be taken forwards. And a personal thank you from me, because I learned a lot, a large amount, just by having the opportunity to speak to each of you individually prior to this, and from the content that you've talked about today. And it's been a really eye-opening experience. So a personal thank you from me for everything that we've had a chance to talk about. And now, just in closing out, we've just finished the Q&A portion here. And I just wanted to say thank you to everyone who joined us today. If you're looking to find out, about follow-up information, we will follow up with you. Advita kindly shared her blog in the chat, and I would highly recommend you give that a read. If you're looking for other content, we do have a podcast series where we tackle these topics, among many others, relating to internal communications, organizational culture. Feel free to sign up for another event if you're interested. We'll hold additional panel discussions like this and many more. And that is it for us today. Thank you so much. Thank you, panelists. Thank you, attendees.
Thank you, Matt.
Thank you. Let's keep having the conversation. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Cheers, guys. Thank you.